King, and the scientists that you were with said, you know, to be humbled by something greater than you. You've seen a lot of the world. Was it a humbling experience?
You are aware Antarctica is a place where if you were not prepared and you were not careful, things can go really, really bad very, very quickly. In order to go there, we all had to get, you know, full physical, dental workups because, you know, if your helicopter goes down, you know, has to make an emergency landing, and the weather gets ugly, there are conditions of, I mean, incredibly extreme, difficult conditions potentially. So everybody has to be prepared for that possibility at all times.
And even then, there's so much that can happen that's completely beyond your control, and getting there is incredibly complicated. Getting out is incredibly complicated.
It's big. It looks like no other place on Earth. It is clean. It is pristine. There's not a single cigarette butt or a bit of waste anywhere. Everybody from whatever country removes everything off of that continent and tries to impact the continent as little as possible. But it's as close to going to Mars as you can get on this planet. It really is another world.
I can't wait to see it. Thank you, Anthony Bourdain. We appreciate it. You're not going to want to miss this. It airs, of course, Sunday night, 9 p.m. right here. Don't miss that must-see TV. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great weekend. I'm Poppy Harlow.
I'm wearing a very different tie than I was just 10 seconds ago.
You gave away our secret.
I'm John Berman. At this hour with Kate Baldwin starts right now.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Poppy. Hello, everyone. I am Kate Baldwin. Mark your calendars. Next Thursday, we are just 6 days away now from what could be the most explosive and dramatic congressional testimony in a generation. Former FBI Director James Comey now set to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee about Russian interference into the 2016 election, a probe that Comey was leading until the president fired him. Comey's expected to lay out his version of events from private conversations with President Trump. Did the president ask Comey to shut down the investigation into Michael Flynn? A big question, and we may soon have a definitive answer, unless, of course, the plot thickens and President Trump tries to assert executive privilege to keep Comey quiet. While all of this is happening, another president is speaking out. Russia's President Vladimir Putin, for the first time, seeming to hint that Russian hackers may have been involved in the election. CNN's Matthew Chance is standing by live in St. Petersburg. But first, let's get to Washington and Jessica Schneider, which is setting up to be the next greatest show on earth coming up next week. Jessica, what do we know?
It is, Kate. You know, this morning, the big question that's emerging, will President Trump exert executive privilege to keep James Comey from testifying, either in full or in part? We know from our sources that Comey wants to tell his story, and he's expected to detail how he felt potential pressure from the president, both when President Trump asked him for personal loyalty shortly after taking office, and also in that now infamous February 14th meeting when the president allegedly asked Comey to shut down the FBI investigation into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and Flynn's ties to Russia. Now, we know at this point that Comey has taken the first step toward testimony. He's consulted with special counsel Robert Mueller about what the parameters of his testimony might be to ensure that there are no legal entanglements in his public account. But this morning, counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, she said that the administration would not rule out the president invoking executive privilege to stop James Comey from testifying.
Well, we'll be watching with the rest of the world when Director Comey testifies. The last time he testified under oath, the FBI had a scurry to correct that testimony. He was off by hundreds of thousands in his count, his sworn testimony count of the number of information, the number of emails that Huma Abedin allegedly sent to her husband, Anthony Weiner. He said there were hundreds of thousands. It turns out that was off by hundreds of thousands.
So the president's not going to invoke executive privilege?
The president will make that decision.
So it remains to be seen what the administration will do. Will the Trump administration, in fact, try to block Comey's testimony? The testimony itself scheduled for 10 a.m. on Thursday, first in a public session and then in a closed-door session at 1 p.m. Now, of course, there are limits to executive privilege, and some are arguing that since James Comey is no longer a government employee, instead a private citizen, any instruction from the president not to testify really wouldn't hold any weight. And in addition, some say the president may have effectively waived executive privilege because he has tweeted about James Comey on several occasions, directly referencing the conversations the two have had. Kate?
Yeah, there are a whole lot of opinions about that executive privilege element of all of this. Great to see you, Jessica. Thank you so much. So now I want to turn to those extraordinary comments from Russian President Vladimir Putin, suggesting for the first time yesterday that Russians may have been involved in hacking the election, but today still definitely denying his government had any hand in it. CNN's senior international correspondent Matthew Chance is in St. Petersburg, Russia, where Vladimir Putin just spoke. So Matthew, Putin spoke at length about this. It almost seemed like talking in circles, though, at times. What exactly is he saying?
Yeah, that's right, Kate. If you were expecting any kind of mea culpa from President Putin here in Russia, where he's addressing the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, you'd be sorely disappointed. He spent the last 36 hours ducking and diving and dodging questions about the Russian involvement, allegedly, in the hacking of the US election and the data dump that followed that in order to discredit, apparently, the campaign of Hillary Clinton. Putin has again denied that his security services had anything to do with that. That's the allegation, of course, made by the US intelligence services. Russia does not hack, is a point he's made time and again. He made it here today. But he also said that hackers are not the kind of people that are normally employed by the Russian government. They're much more, well, free-spirited than that. Take a listen.
Hackers are free people, just like artists. They wake up in a good mood and paint things. Same with hackers. They woke up today, read something about the state-to-state relations. If they are patriotic, they contribute in a way they think is right, to fight against those who say bad things about Russia.
All right, well, patriotic artists is how he characterized them, fighting against those who are effectively bad-mouthing Russia. So, you know, hidden in there, it sounds like another one of those categorical denials, but hidden in there somewhere is at least the admission for the first time by Vladimir Putin that it could have been Russians, patriotic civilians not affiliated with the Russian security services, but Russians nevertheless, he admitted, could have been behind this hacking scandal.
Matthew, well, I have to ask you, yesterday we played some of that extraordinary encounter that you had with the Russian banker who met with Jared Kushner back during the transition. The motive behind that meeting, and now part of under scrutiny by the FBI and definitely part of this whole conversation. Can you tell me about that encounter and what's happened?
Yeah, you're right. It was an extraordinary encounter. Sergei Gorkov, the head of one of Russia's biggest banks, the Vnesheconombank, didn't want to answer any of our questions. But there are these huge questions that we all want answers to. For instance, he met Jared Kushner in December last year in Trump Tower in New York. What did they talk about? The bank says they talked about business, and Kushner was there as a representative of his family property business. The White House had a very different take, saying he was there for diplomacy as part of his role in the Trump transition team. We want to know what they actually discussed. And so I managed to pin down Sergei Gorkov and try and get some answers from him.
Mr. Gorkov, quick question. What did you really speak to Jared Kushner about in New York when you met him in December?
No comments.
Did you talk about sanctions? Excuse me.
No comments.
But what was discussed? The White House says it was a diplomatic meeting, that Kushner met you as part of the transition team. Your bank says it was a business meeting.
Thank you so much.
So Mr. Gorkov not very happy to speak to us and be confronted in that way about this issue. But still, those questions are out there and they will need to be answered at some point. Kate.
Yeah, definitely not happy to get the questions, but good you're asking the questions regardless. Great to see you, Matthew. Thank you. Joining me right now to continue this discussion is Jill Wine-Banks. She's a former assistant Watergate special prosecutor. She's joining us now. And Scott Jennings, he's here. He's a former special assistant to President George W. Bush. And also Michael Moore, a former U.S. attorney. All, thank you so much for being here. A lot to get to as we laid out there with Jessica and Matthew Chance. Jill, I want to get your take. This issue of executive privilege. Kellyanne Conway was asked about it this morning, said, you know, it's up to the president. Do you think the president has a case if he wanted to assert executive privilege to keep James Comey from testifying next week?
Based on my experience in Watergate, no. A conversation about a crime is not protected by executive privilege. So that if James Comey's testimony is going to be that the president obstructed justice by asking him to drop the investigation of Flynn, that would be a criminal conversation and not protected by executive privilege.
Well, another element of this, and Scott, we'll talk about obstruction of justice specifically in just a second, but Michael, a lot of folks are saying that the president, regardless of the obstruction of justice question, that the president's already waived his, I don't know, right to executive privilege with the tweets and statements that he has made about his conversations with James Comey. I mean, more broadly speaking, what role could the president's Twitter feed play in Robert Mueller's Russia investigation, do you think?
You know, I think this is another example of when his mouth and his thumbs are coming back to haunt him. You know, we talk about the issue of waiving the privilege, and one of the things you've got to think about is essentially he's accused Comey of a crime. At some point he's alleged, I believe, that Comey gave false testimony to Congress. That can sometimes serve as a basis of a waiver for a privilege when somebody who's part of that privileged conversation has to then defend themselves against criminal allegations. So, you know, I think that plays in and may actually be one basis for a waiver if we get there. And I agree with you, first, speaker. There are legitimate reasons to have the executive privilege, to think about policy and have discussions without fear of having to disclose those. But it was never intended. It is not intended now to be used as a tool to engage in a criminal cover-up.
Scott, politically speaking, what's a bigger risk, though, for the president on this one? Letting James Comey testify or trying to block him, stop him from testifying, and then, you know, letting it linger out there? What is he trying to keep Comey from saying?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, let alone the White House counsel, so I'll let them and the other lawyers talk about whether executive privilege applies here. I think as a political and a public matter, there are a lot of Republicans that would like to see James Comey answer a lot of questions that are lingering out there. For instance, if you had this conversation in February and thought maybe a crime had been committed, why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you bring it up in your testimony on May 3rd? Why on May 3rd did you indicate that you had not been pressured to shut down an investigation? Why did your deputy on May the 11th say that he didn't believe anyone had pressured them to stop any investigations? There's a lot of questions like that Republicans want to see answered. So I think for that reason alone, a lot of people in the Republican side want to see Comey come to the table and answer what I think are going to be tough questions.
Well, and actually, let me ask you this, Scott, because Lindsey Graham was just on Fox News, and he was saying that he hopes that he doesn't think that the testimony is going to be helpful. Lindsey Graham had a bit of a different take. And the reason that he said is that he thinks that this is kind of, the way he laid it out was he kind of thinks that this is a disgruntled employee, that anytime that it would be a hit job against President Trump because he had just been fired by President Trump and now he's coming to testify before Congress about it. Do you see this as a hit job?
Well, I certainly think there are questions about why it took so long for the existence of these memos that he supposedly wrote to come out. Again, there are a lot of people who have jumped to conclusions here and have brought up things like obstruction of justice. If Jim Comey, at that moment, the director of the FBI, thought the president was trying to obstruct justice in February, why in the world did he wait until after he was relieved of his duties several weeks later to bring up the concept that obstruction may have occurred, that memos had been written about it? It strikes me that a lot of reasonable people could look at those actions and include, yes, he just has sour grapes about losing his job. That's why I think ultimately the fact that he is apparently going to answer questions is a good thing. There are other questions he has to answer. Are your associates leaking information about this behind the scenes?
Hang on one second. Michael, on that one point that he made, if James Comey had this memo back in whenever and he didn't come forward, does he have an obligation to come forward?
No, he's in the middle. Comey was in the middle and the FBI in the middle of an ongoing criminal investigation. They've told us that. We know that was going on into Russia, into the campaign's contacts with Russia. And so there's nothing unusual at all about an agent, much less the head of the FBI, who's leading the investigation, continuing on, but documenting the file. That's why that contemporaneous memo is so important. The very fact that he, after that conversation with Trump, apparently made some record of it and included that in the file, I think that adds a great deal of credibility and reliability to what he has to say. It would not surprise me at all to find out that he indicated somewhere in his memo something that was easily provable. For instance, he might say there were 4 people in the room and these were who they were and they left at a certain time, and something that could be backtracked that will even add more credibility and reliability to what he has to say. So I don't find it odd.
Kate, let me ask a question, Kate.
Hold on one second, Scott.
Let me ask a question of the lawyer. Yeah.
Hold on one second, Scott. Jill, do you think James Comey's credibility is in question here?
I think it's a very interesting issue, and I agree with Michael that the contemporaneous memo is really a credible source of information. It's what agents are trained to do. It's even what lawyers are trained to do. We write down exactly what happened and when it happened, and it will speak for itself. I agree, though, that there are a lot of questions about Comey, and I think that that's why we need the public hearing so that the American people can evaluate exactly what happened. What did the president say? What did James Comey do? I think those are important questions, and hopefully next week we'll get the answers to them.
Yeah, Scott, go ahead. What was your question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask. I mean, if what's in this memo is said to is true, if what is in there is true, then why didn't he tell somebody? How is it that the deputy director of the FBI didn't know about it when he testified on May 11th? How is it that Comey didn't bring it up himself when he testified on May the 3rd? The timeline of this is what has a lot of Republicans questioning credibility. I'm not disputing that the memo is credible. I'm not disputing that what's in it is true, if in fact it is true. But the timeline here has a lot of Republicans out there wondering, did he just bring this up to try to make a stink about it because he lost his job? I think it's a legitimate question, and I hope the members of Congress that are on the committee get a chance to dig deep on that.
Michael, what do you think?
Well, no.
Kate, could I answer that?
You both can. Michael, go first.
Well, I mean,
okay.
I think it's clear that he wouldn't have disclosed it at the time. I mean, he was in an ongoing investigation, and I was critical of Comey when he came out and talked about the Clinton email scandal in the middle of an ongoing investigation, especially right before an election. That's just against Department of Justice policy to do that. In this instance, I applaud him for the fact that he kept things close to the vest and he was directing the investigation. So there's just nothing unusual to me about the person who's in charge and leading the investigation of being able to steer it, watch it, see what evidence comes in, and take that in context with his experience that he had with the president of the White House.
Go ahead, Jill.
I was going to say much the same thing because I agree exactly with that, is that it is a good question as to why he didn't report it, but the answer is clear. It was an ongoing investigation, and so you keep it quiet. He did violate the rules of the department in a very terrible way by talking about the Clinton emails, and he did have a choice then. He said, I either had to conceal or reveal, but actually he had the choice of doing a 2-day investigation like he eventually did, in which case he would have said nothing because there was nothing there. And that's what he should have done. Every baby lawyer at the Department of Justice knows that you say, I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of an investigation. And he didn't do that then, but he did do it now.
You're an idiot because the Jews are to blame, right?
Russian President Vladimir Putin just moments ago with an eyebrow-raising defense against charges that Russia was behind the hack into the 2016 election there. So what is Putin trying to do? Does it mean anything now for the Russia investigation? Here with me to discuss, Alex Burns is here. He's a national political reporter at the New York Times. Democratic strategist Hillary Rosen is here with us. And former congressman and former senior advisor to the Trump campaign, Congressman Jack Kingston, is here as well. Great to see you all. Thanks so much for being here. So, Alex, fascinating and startling, the words coming from Vladimir Putin today. But we've got two things from him in the last couple days. Yesterday, hinting that hackers were like artists, and they could be patriotic artists, and hinting that the hacks could have come from Russia, but today making very clear that he says Russian government did not have a hand in it, was not behind it. This is new in this long, drawn-out saga. I'm not sure what it means, though.
Well, it's really sort of expert trolling on the global stage here, right?
At the very least, yeah.
You have this kind of wink to the audience that, you know, well, I personally didn't hack, but, you know, I don't know about folks out there who are very patriotic. That was really revealing yesterday. You know, today you've heard Putin a number of times over the last year sort of get into intra-Democratic Party politics, talking about Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Bernie Sanders, and in ways that he has to know are going to be aggravating to people in the United States. None of it, I think, is terribly helpful to the president, right? That any time Vladimir Putin is out there looking like he's a sympathetic ally of this White House, you know, for folks who believe that the White House is too close to Russia already, which polls indicate is most people, I don't know that that's a great look. I don't know that it has any real concrete consequences, but just optically, it's pretty awkward.
Yeah, but to his point, the President Putin went kind of deep, saying that basically, almost mirroring what we've seen from Donald Trump on Twitter very recently, that this is the Democrats' excuse for why they lost the election. I mean, Putin even went into his own political analysis of how Trump did better. He reached out to voters better.
This is why people suspect that Trump and Putin are actually a lot closer than they may be, because they're very much alike. All of the press reports yesterday actually said that Vladimir Putin admitted that the Russians were involved in this hacking.
In a very Putin-esque way,
right,
which
and
was
so
admit, not
today
admit, hint,
he
wink.
comes back out and sort of tries to deflect and come up with a different explanation for it. That's very Trumpian.
Yeah. Putin-esque and
Kate,
Trumpian. Go ahead, Congressman.
Kate, I think in the words of Ed Ball, confusion to the enemy, and I think what Putin is doing is he is just adding more confusion. I think the left is adding to it in their own maybe innocent, maybe deliberative political way, but the reality is we could ignore Russia. We could handle all these Russian issues a little quieter, a little bit more orderly, except for the left keeps throwing the political flames on it, the political kerosene, if you will. I think Putin is just enjoying it. I think he can go out there. The left has made him incredibly relevant. It started with the reset from Hillary Clinton. It started with her giving away 20%. Absolutely. This goes back to the Obama administration when Russia was on its knees. They went in there, rushed in there, sold them 20% of our uranium and did the great reset. Remember the loving and the hugging?
Stay in the present.
This goes way back.
Congress is a member of the National Security Council, a hugely important country. Russia is relevant regardless. I mean, I do think that stepping back here for a minute
you guys are making
important.
Putin relevant. And you know, it started out with the reset, and then Russia decided, look, we're not going to go along with the Obama administration. I don't frankly think they were very close to the Trump people at all, except for that's how the narrative developed. And so they thought, okay, look, we're going to ride this wave. Confusion to America, it's good for us.
And
what
Jack
he's
just admitted something very important.
Is split us up.
Jack just admitted something very important, which was that actually Putin did not like the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. And what he did then was get involved in the U.S. election. Now we have, 13 national security agencies and reports and evidence proving that, in fact, that is exactly what they did. They got involved in the election.
Hillary,
hold on,
let me agree with you there, but they've been doing that.
Jack, I'm not finished. I'll let you finish. Just on the bigger picture here, it is important to know that the reason this is all relevant is because the Russians had an interest in the U.S. election and exercised
I'm jumping in
their
because
interest.
that interest is actually one thing I do want to get everyone's take on, and we have no time. So, Congressman Kingston, listen to me. There's a new reporting by Michael Isikoff with Yahoo that early on in the Trump administration, Trump officials were exploring over the State Department options for rolling back the sanctions against Russia. So much so that the former Obama State Department folks were concerned and reached out to members of Congress to try to stop it from happening because they thought it was such a real possibility. In your view, why do you think they were working on this so early on? Why was this a priority, do you think, early on in the administration?
I think in terms of looking at their options and dealing with ISIS in Syria and continuing the work that John Kerry failed to do, which was to try to get Russia to help us in Syria, I think that is a carrot that's out there. Both sides know that. There's nothing unusual about that whatsoever. What we were trying to do with Kerry and the Obama administration is to say, what can we swap out? How can we get you on the same team with us in the fight against terrorism? And so, there's two sets of sanctions. One statutory, passed by Congress, and the other was executive orders by the Obama administration. So a new incoming administration, I think, would be negligent in not looking at possible options. And that is if the above is true.
Well, of course, if the above is true. That's according to Michael Isikoff of Yahoo. Alex, I want you to have a final thought here, my friend. How big of a deal is this?
I think the whole notion of the administration's relationship with Russia is and has always been a really big deal. And frankly, I don't think the congressman is right that it's just a matter of standard practice that any administration would think about unilateral sanctions relief on Russia. But it's also not terribly surprising based on the rhetoric, the open rhetoric we heard from the president throughout the campaign. He never made a secret of his admiration for Russia, his desire for much, much closer cooperation.
Every single country has come under criticism by Donald Trump, never Russia. Why?
But
remember, stand by. We're going to fight this out in the break, Congressman. You know I love you. Stand by, guys. Thank you very much. Did President Trump jump the gun by calling the attack in the Philippines terror during his speech in the Rose Garden? The new explanation now coming from the White House. That is ahead. Plus, does President Trump believe that climate change is a hoax? He has said it in tweets before. The White House won't say now. I'll speak. While the president's views the deal at large as a bad deal for the American worker, his thoughts on if human activity contributes to climate change are a bit murkier.
Can you say whether or not the president believes that human activity is contributing to the warming of the climate?
Honestly, I haven't asked him.
and get back to you.
Does the president believe climate change is a hoax?
This is not about whether climate change is occurring or not.
Does President Trump still believe climate change is a hoax?
What President Trump believes is he was elected to grow the U.S. economy.
But with all due respect, Gary, you're not answering the question. Do you know, have you discussed this with the president, does he still believe that climate change, global warming is a hoax?
I'm answering what the president is committed to. Look, you're going to have to ask him. You're going to actually have to ask him.
Does he believe global warming is a hoax?
He believes in clean air, clean water, a clean environment, and he believes that we have to negotiate better deals for this country.
I'll ask it one more time. Does he believe global warming is a hoax?
You should ask him that.
Joining me now is Ernest Moniz. He served as Energy Secretary, of course, for President Obama when the Paris Accord was agreed to and signed. Secretary, thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure, Kate.
So I read your opinion piece on the president's announcement. You, to say the very least, you disagree with the president's decision. What is he getting most wrong, in your view, Secretary?
Well, first of all, I think the decision accomplished many unfortunate things all at once. It reinforced, I think, the lack of confidence in our allies and friends about our reliability. And when you combine his statement yesterday with his budget proposal, it undercuts the innovation agenda that is actually the real issue in terms of jobs in the United States. So I think, and I've said, I think history will look very, very poorly on this decision. I will add, however, a silver lining here is that we do see already not only other countries stepping forward with leadership, but most importantly in the United States, we see cities and states and business leaders also saying we're going to keep on this pathway to a low-carbon future.
And to that point, about 80 mayors representing about 39 million Americans and also many big businesses, they have said that they're going to keep going. They're going to keep with the commitments laid out in the accord, regardless of what the president does. With that in mind, do you think some of the bigger, broader statements about the how negatively this decision will impact the country, do you think that's overblown?
Well, I think there's no question this decision, if the federal government is not kind of rowing in the same direction with our governors and our business leaders and our mayors, it makes the job much harder. It's going to make it harder for the United States and more expensive ultimately to comply. However, again, it's not. Hopefully it won't be catastrophic because we will have these commitments. You know, right now, states that require, for example, more renewables deployment, they cover 70% of the U.S. population, for example. States and regions will take leadership. Mayors are taking leadership. As I said, very importantly, we've already seen major corporate leaders, including in the oil and gas industry, come forward and say, look, we are heading to a low-carbon future. We have to do business. We do business globally, and we're going to keep going. For one thing, I think as well, we will see what happens. But I think the president's decision may invite very unfortunate trade retaliation in terms of carbon pricing for American exports.
Larry Summers made a statement about this accord, and he called the decision the biggest U.S. foreign policy error since entering the Iraq War. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a strong case for that to be made, and I would add on both counts the 2003 Iraq War and now this climate decision. Look, this is an issue of global concern.
What's the case, Mr. Secretary?
Well, this is an issue of global concern and global commitment. The United States has been an indispensable leader on many fronts, including the climate front, including the energy innovation front. In fact, on the latter, I want to keep going back to that because the innovation agenda really is the jobs agenda. We played a leadership role in having over 20 countries commit to doubling down on innovation investments. The budget proposal of this administration, rather than doubling it, it proposes having it. Well, that just dulls our competitive edge.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to ask you one quick question because the White House and cabinet officials, they've been facing a lot of questions about this. And by my count, at least 5 White House officials and cabinet secretaries after this announcement have refused to say whether the president believes global warming is a hoax still. No matter where he lands on this, do you think the president needs to make his view known?
Well, let me say, first of all, I do want to emphasize that the cabinet officials with security responsibilities, I think we're encouraging him to stay in the deal because it's a national security risk. In terms of the science and climate change, you're absolutely right. As far as I know, he has not answered the question. But I have to say that implicitly, his announcement and the statements of Administrator Pruitt following the announcement implicitly suggest that they understand climate change has to be addressed. So maybe that's a little bit of a silver lining, but we have to keep pushing that. Let me say the science is unambiguous in terms of human intervention for global warming, and any prudent person would want a robust response because of the enormous risks we face, not to mention the opportunities presented by a multi-trillion-dollar international clean energy marketplace.
Secretary Ernest Moniz, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Coming up for us, Steve Bannon was front and center during President Trump's big climate accord announcement. Is this a sign, another sign, of a power shift in the White House? Details on that ahead.
All right, while world leaders are condemning the president's decision to exit the Paris climate deal, top Republicans at home are cheering it. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell calls the decision another blow to Obama's war on coal. House Speaker Paul Ryan called the Paris Accord a raw deal.
Joining us now, J.D. Vance. He grew up in the Rust Belt. He's a CNN contributor and author of the book Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and a culture in crisis. J.D., I want to talk about Paris in just a second, but we need to start with Moscow. As it were right now, and the issues about Russia and the investigation swirling around this White House. James Comey testifies next week, 6 days from now, in fact 6 days and 12 minutes from now. A lot of people are looking at this as a key moment for the White House and this presidency. When I say a lot of people, does that include people in the middle of the country, where you are right now in Columbus, Ohio?
Yeah, well, I think the conversation about the Russia investigation and the feelings that people have about that investigation very often overlap with how people feel about the media. And I often find that when folks talk about Russia, they very often also pair it with a distrust of the media, perhaps a feeling that the media is being unfair to President Trump. And it's really difficult to untangle those two sentiments. Now, I will say that if we're talking about Trump's base, we really have to keep in mind two separate groups of voters. And so one group of voters is the really passionate core base of Trump voters, probably 20% of the electorate. They're not going to really abandon the president no matter what Comey says. But there are a lot of folks who voted for Donald Trump who still give him positive approval ratings, but who opinion polling shows are actually pretty soft in their support. And I see when I talk to folks like that, the sort of soft Trump voters, that Comey, the investigation, the constant drip, drip, drip of conversation about Russia and potential collusion does have a softening impact among the soft group of Trump supporters.
J.D., the president promised coal miners, you're going to go back to work. You're born in Kentucky, you grew up in Ohio, you know these towns, you know these people. We've seen it on the ground. Are these people en masse going to go back to work because the president pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Well, no, because the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, was non-binding, and so a lot of the commitments that the United States made, even if you think that the United States shouldn't have made those commitments, they were effectively voluntary, and so it's really tough to argue that pulling out of that accord is going to bring a lot of people back to work. What I find so amazing about this conversation is that when you talk to folks who are involved in the coal industry, folks who live in these areas, they're very realistic about the fact that a lot of those jobs are not coming back. And I think that what that shows is that we really have to be asking ourselves, what's the next generation of American jobs? What are people going to be doing 10, 20, 30 years down the road? And it's so interesting to me how much of the national conversation is driven by, can we bring coal miners back to work? And when you talk to folks on the ground, they're actually a lot more realistic about what the economy is going to be looking like in a decade or two.
It's such an interesting conversation because, how many coal miners are there? 50 to 70,000?
50,000 coal miners in America right now.
And 115,000 people who work for JCPenney alone, J.D. Vance. And if you listen to the president sometimes, you would think that the coal miner caucus, as it were, is the most important symbolic thing, for the American economy. And it's not that we shouldn't try to save every job that we can, and it's not that every job's not important, but it almost seems that he's saying that certain Americans are more important or more American than others.
Well, there's obviously a very important symbolic role for coal, and if you talk to folks who work in the coal industry, who had grandparents, parents who worked in the coal industry, it is really important. In some ways, it's almost associated with the geography of eastern Kentucky or West Virginia in a way that most industries aren't. But even still, even the fact that, even if you accept the fact that coal has this really large symbolic power, which it does, people on the ground, again, are pretty pessimistic about whether the coal economy is ever going to be able to employ hundreds of thousands of people in these regions. And so what you see when you see the conversation driven so much by whether these coal jobs are going to be coming back, it doesn't necessarily match up with the real cynicism that exists on the ground. And I think that if we really want to help these people, and we should want to help these people, I mean, these are good, hardworking Americans, but we have to be talking about what's next. What's the economy of the next 10 or 20 years going to be driven by, and how do we prepare people for those jobs and that type of work?
And I think just from the little bit of time I've spent talking to these folks in Kentucky, Ohio, elsewhere, it is not just the 50,000 coal miners. It is, J.D., what coal mining represented as the ability to work a 40, 50-hour work week and provide for your family. So it touches a lot more people than just those that are directly employed. That said, when I was in Beattyville not that long ago after the election, a woman named Donna Coomer came to me and she said, the coal trucks are already out. She felt more hope then than she had felt since Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty in Kentucky, right? Is this president being disingenuous with these people that their livelihood will completely turn around?
Yeah, well, I don't know if he's being disingenuous, obviously. I don't know what's in the president's mind, but I do think from just a basic economic and, frankly, political fact of life that the White House needs to keep in mind is that these areas do have really high unemployment rates, really low labor force participation rates. They do need good jobs, and unfortunately, they don't have those jobs right now. Now, you can talk about the coal industry, and obviously it does have this symbolic importance, but unless you can actually bring new jobs, better jobs, jobs outside of the coal industry to these areas, they're still going to really, really suffer. And I think consequently, while the president may not pay a political price tomorrow, if 2 years from now, if 4 years from now, people are still looking around and saying, where are the jobs? How can I find good work, either in the coal industry or outside of it? Then the president and the Republican Party, they're going to pay a political price because of it.
Jay, we got just a few seconds left. Back to Russia for 1 second. You talk about the need for shared facts in this country. When James Comey testifies under oath and says things out loud, do you think those will be considered facts?
Well, I think they will for most people, but I do think that one of the biggest problems that this entire Russia investigation has revealed in our country is that we have really serious problems of institutional mistrust of the press, not from maybe a majority of the country, but certainly from a pretty large minority. And I think we have to deal with that. We have to recognize that a lot of what's coming out of the so-called mainstream media is mistrusted by a large segment of the country. We've got to deal with that problem, because if we don't, then we are going to have two separate sets of facts that our political conversation operates under, and that's not healthy for anybody.
No. James Comey's not a reporter. Doesn't work for any media organization, just to be clear. So if he says it, it's not so much of a media thing, but I get your point there.
I found that. I felt that distrust in Beattyville, Kentucky, but I found, J.D., when I went and I spent an hour with some of these folks, and just talked to them, and they didn't feel like they were being talked at by the media, they opened up their doors and their arms to us. So maybe more conversations ahead. J.D. Vance, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yesterday, the president called out directly the people of Youngstown, Ohio. So what do they think about his move on climate? 6 days away to the hour from what will go down in history as potentially unprecedented testimony, or are we?
Just a short while ago, one of the president's top aides would not rule out using executive privilege to keep, the president using executive privilege to keep the man that he fired, James Comey, from testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Let's get straight to Joe Johns at the White House. What we're learning about this, Joe.
Hi, John. Well, this is drama. The date's now set. It's next Thursday, June 8th. And the big question in Washington, D.C. right now is what will former FBI Director James Comey say on Capitol Hill? What won't he say? What can't he say? Because there is a special counsel investigation underway right now. There's also drama surrounding the question of whether the administration might try to block his testimony by invoking the doctrine of executive privilege, which protects the conversations and communications between certain high-ranking members of the government, including the president. So listen now to how presidential advisor Kellyanne Conway talked about the testimony next week of James Comey on another network this morning.
Does he want former Director Comey to testify before Congress?
Well, we'll be watching with the rest of the world when Director Comey testifies. The last time he testified under oath, the FBI had a scurry to correct that testimony. He was off by hundreds of thousands in his count, his sworn testimony count of the number of information, the number of emails that Huma Abedin allegedly sent to her husband, Anthony Weiner. He said there were hundreds of thousands. Turns out that was off by hundreds of thousands.
So the president's not going to invoke executive privilege?
The president will make that decision.
Couple of problems with invoking executive privilege. Number one, James Comey's no longer a government employee. Number two, the president may have waived it, some experts say, because he's talked so much and tweeted so much about James Comey, the Russia investigation, and related issues. So all up in the air. John Poppy, back to you.
All right, Joe Johns at the White House, thank you very much. Now to the new questions surrounding conflicting stories about Jared Kushner's meeting with Russia's banker, Sergei Gorkov. The Washington Post now reporting the meeting may have taken place one day before Gorkov got in a plane to fly to meet with Vladimir Putin. Our Diane Gallagher is in Washington with all of the details. Good morning.
Good morning, Poppy, John. And yeah, this situation isn't a case of did the meeting happen. It's why did the meeting happen, and they can't seem to get on the same page about that, which, of course, doesn't look very good, but it also has the potential to be a serious problem in the future. A U.S. official tells us that the FBI is looking into these specific discrepancies. The banker is Sergei Gorkov. He's the chairman of a U.S.-sanctioned Russian bank, and he's also a former spy who, we're told, has very close ties to President Vladimir Putin. Now, the White House tells us that Kushner met with him in his official transition role, official capacity, kind of along the lines of foreign relations. But the bank said that this was strictly business, as in private business, real estate business, and Kushner was not a representative of Trump. So the question here is, when did the meeting take place? And it's a little bit hazy. We know what happened sometime in December. CNN has reported that the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, also had a secret meeting with Kushner back in the first days of December. That's where our sources say that Kislyak urged Kushner to meet with Gorkov. Well, according to some great reporting from the Washington Post, there was a private jet linked to Gorkov that flew from Moscow to the States on December 13th. The Post said they couldn't really confirm if Gorkov was on the flight, but the plane then left from Newark to Japan on the next day, and on December 15th and 16th, Putin was in Japan. Russian media said Gorkov was going to be there joining him. Here's the thing, though. With all of that, Kushner initially left that Gorkov meeting, and the one with Kislyak, off his security forms. He did add them a day later, but that's after they were reported in the media. We have reported that Kushner, John Poppy, is saying that he will speak with Senate Intel Committee about anything related to the Russia investigation.
All right, Diane Gallagher in Washington, thanks so much. Let's talk about more about all of this. Alice Conant joins us now, former RNC and White House spokesman is here. David Gergen, CNN senior political analyst and former advisor to many presidents, and Dan Pfeiffer, CNN political commentator, former senior advisor to President Obama. David Gergen, well, the New York Times yesterday raised the possibility of the president declaring executive privilege. I sort of raised my eyebrows and went, oh? When Kellyanne Conway would not rule out this morning, I sort of went, wow. Look, we don't know if the president will try to block James Comey from testifying. What we do know is that it's not a definite no right now, and to me that seems significant.
It is significant, John, and it would be a major decision by the president, be extremely controversial to try to block him. I think it would probably lead to maybe some sort of court action about whether the president waived his right to invoke executive privilege. Just we heard from Joe Johns, there is this question about all the tweeting and what the president himself has said. is he really going to be able legally to block somebody else from describing what happened when he himself has put out his own version? But I must tell you, I think it'd be a terrible mistake for the White House to invoke executive privilege. They ought to look back to what Ronald Reagan did when he was in the midst of the Iran-Contra crisis, and that is he was being accused of all sorts of things. There was even talk of impeaching Ronald Reagan back in his second term over Iran-Contra. And what did Reagan do? He waived executive privilege for everyone. He said, I want everybody to go testify. He made all the documents available to the Congress. He essentially was totally transparent, and he pierced the bubble, made the whole thing go away. This White House should take a lesson out of that book.
Alex, to you, the second really newsy part of what Kellyanne Conway said is she directly, without being asked, started discrediting James Comey, saying he got facts wrong, which is true. He had to correct his last congressional testimony. But does it seem to you like a strategy that this White House is coming forth with, that they will try to discredit anything that James Comey says? How significant is that, what Kellyanne Conway did?
No, it's a great question and a great point. But look, they're acting appropriately in that case, in the sense that this is going to be fought in the court of public opinion, not in a legal courtroom. So rather than lawyering up like some people in the Trump administration seem to be urging the president to do, he should be more transparent about what happened. He should lay out all the facts. As David just said, he should waive executive privilege for everybody. He should make all the documents available. He should give a big press conference where he answers all these questions. Encourage his staff, encourage his son-in-law to talk to the media, to talk publicly about what happened so we can get all of the facts out there and move on. And so to your question about, what should they do about Comey, they should let him testify. But then they should also that same day present their version of events. Don't just let Comey be the only voice out there. Recognize that this is a political fight. They need to be waging a campaign, and that starts with getting the facts out and framing what happened in terms that are most favorable to the president.
Dan Pfeiffer, I'm curious what you're going to be looking for next Thursday at this time. Remembering, James Comey, we think, is going to testify that the president tried to get him to back off the Michael Flynn investigation. And when he says that, he'll no longer be an anonymous source, or there won't be anonymous sources feeding that story. It's going to be someone saying it under oath in front of cameras, in front of the whole nation.
Yeah, I'll be looking for a couple things. One, I want to see how Comey recounts the dinner they had, the private conversation in the Oval Office, whether the details of what Comey says matches up with reporting that we've all read in recent weeks. The image of that is potentially very powerful for people around the country and will be played on a loop on TV and on the internet. I'm also curious to see how the Republican members of the committee react to that, because we should be very clear that this is basically the textbook example of abuse of power. It is what, when we think about Watergate, what Nixon did, and I want to see whether they are going to seem like they really want to get to the bottom of what happened with both the hacking and what the Trump administration has done around the investigation, or is it just going to be to read partisan talking points to support Trump? That's really what we want to see, because as long as the Republicans are sticking by Trump out of pure partisan tribalism, he's going to be okay in the short term. But if they begin to turn, this could move quickly.
Alex, we had Congressman Pete Hoekstra on last hour, and John's first question to him was, should the president invoke executive privilege? In his words, I think absolutely, right?
He said, does he have the right to? And
does he have the right to? Absolutely. He at no point in the interview said that the president should not do this. And he said, it's a one-sided story otherwise. James Comey just gets to say his bit. But has the president not already told at least part of his side of the story on multiple mediums, on Twitter, in these network interviews?
Well, yes, by labeling it fake news and attacking Comey. But he still hasn't answered.
And detailing his conversations with Comey in part.
To a certain extent. But look, I think that transparency here is the friend of the Trump administration. If they try to hold back information, if they try to prevent people from speaking to Congress, speaking to Republicans in Congress, mind you, if they try to prevent that, it's going to end in disaster for the Trump administration. Time is not their friend here. They need to get all the facts out. They need to be more transparent. They should encourage people to go testify before Congress, and they should say out of hand, they should reject out of hand this idea that they're going to assert executive privilege to prevent somebody like Comey from testifying before the Republicans in Congress who asked him to come testify. So, look, I think that they are handling this not very well, in the sense that they're listening to the lawyers instead of the communicators. And this is, at the end of the day, a public relations problem, not a legal problem for the administration. It's going to be fought in the court in the political arena.
If transparency is the friend of this administration. It's a friend it doesn't hang out with very much. I'll just say that. You know, David Gergen, I'm curious about Jared Kushner right now because there are all the talks about the meeting with the Russian banker and if his story matches up with the Russians. Inside the White House, because you've been there a lot, what's it like to be a senior advisor right now when the focus is on you for something potentially untoward?
It's extremely uncomfortable. It's very distracting. It's very hard to get your mind on business. And you spend a lot of time with lawyers because in this case right now, Jared Kushner has to be extremely careful what he says to people. He cannot be in a position where he can. It's later claimed that he's witness tampering. There are people around him who are going to eventually testify. If he goes up and gives them instructions about how to think about this or that, that can be considered tampering. It's one of the reasons why I think that Jared Kushner should be considering the possibility in a serious way of taking a leave of absence, his views were rejected by the president on climate change. His views have been rejected on some other things. He must wonder, why am I taking this beating as I am inside here, and maybe there's a better way to handle this and take a temporary leave of absence while this clear the air. And I do agree, transparency should be the friend of this administration.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling that Jared has not given an interview since these accusations were first raised. The American people should hear from him directly, and he should answer these questions, and then we can move on.
He is on the cover of Time magazine this week. Remember that when that was Steve Bannon, when he wasn't in a great light not that long ago. We'll watch. Guys, thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Alex Conant, David Gergen, Dan Pfeiffer. It could be the most significant congressional testimony since Watergate. Fired FBI Director James Comey set to testify 6 days to the hour from now on Capitol Hill. The journalist who blew the lid off Watergate, Carl Bernstein, joins us.
And there's a little bit something about the comparison right there. Plus, the president cites cities like Youngstown to sell his reasoning for withdrawing from the Paris deal. But what does the mayor...
The president directed him to curtail the FBI investigation, how that was worded. But I think something much bigger is happening right now, and that is that we need to understand what is being covered up by the President of the United States and those around him. The FBI knows there's a cover-up going on, but we don't know what the cover-up is about. Is it about financial matters with the Trump organization? Is it about actual collusion with Russians? We're going to find that out as these investigations move on. And what we're seeing, particularly from the White House, is the President of the United States playing to his base, sending out Kellyanne Conway this morning. She's a serial fabulist, sending her out to go to the base because that's what he is betting, Trump is betting, is his insurance policy as these investigations close in, that his base will not abandon him. And it's also even related to the decision, I'm told, to go ahead and get the United States out of the climate agreement because it appeals to his base. He needs that base because these investigators are making real progress.
The president, though, apparently didn't send out Kellyanne Conway fully armed with all the facts because she didn't have an answer when she was asked, will the White House invoke executive privilege here on this testimony? Is supposed to be in 6 days. We were just speaking about who the pivot point could be of the Republicans who sit on the Intelligence Committee that he will testify in front of. Who is going to be most important, do you believe, from the Republican side in their line of questioning?
I don't know who they've designated, and I don't think it makes much difference. What we're going to see are members of that committee on both sides comport themselves in different ways, and we'll find out whether or not Republicans are interested in getting to the truth in these matters, or whether they want to continue the White House line that the real issue here is leaks, the press, Democrats, the president's political enemies, the same kind of agenda that we heard Kellyanne Conway time and time again put out there that has nothing to do with the real facts here, which is the Russians interfered in our free elections, and we need to know what the president and those around him might have done that would have advanced the interest of the Russians, whether witting or unwittingly. That's what the president is up against. That's what people in the White House tell me he's concerned about, what knowledge might be forthcoming about that, witting or unwitting, on his part and those around him, including his son-in-law, including others. We need to see what these people are going to testify. We've got a long way to go in these congressional investigations, but especially keep in mind, we have a special prosecutor who is gearing up for a huge investigation.
And along those lines, Carl, first of all, you say there's a cover-up here. The White House calls it a witch hunt. So there's a difference of opinion between you and the White House on this, I will say that. But you say there's a special prosecutor. Hang on, Carl, hang on. So there obviously is a special prosecutor investigation, which gets me to my question about James Comey. How much do you think he will be willing to discuss? Because you laid out a whole bunch of areas that you'd like to hear from him, but how far do you think he'll be willing to go? Will he just talk about the conversations he had with the president insofar as it relates to Michael Flynn? Will he talk about the Russia investigation?
I'm a great believer in a situation like this to be a reporter, and let's wait and see what happens. It depends partly on what he and the special prosecutor have agreed can go before this committee without endangering the special prosecutor's investigation and his witnesses, etc., etc. But in terms of a cover-up, there is no question that there is a cover-up going on. It doesn't mean that there's an obstruction of justice. But when we see Kellyanne Conway, the President of the United States, those who work for him, refuse to go into the details for 6 months now of what happened during their campaign, that is why the special prosecutor, the FBI, have proceeded on the assumption that there is, more than an assumption, a cover-up. It doesn't mean it's an obstruction of justice, that the law has necessarily been broken, but in terms of covering up to keep the American people, the Congress of the United States, and investigators from knowing all the relevant facts, it's undeniable, and people in the White House will tell you that.
Carl Bernstein, thanks so much for being with us. Have an excellent weekend, sir. Appreciate your time. President Trump says he made a decision on the Paris climate deal for places like Youngstown, Ohio. Is Youngstown, Ohio saying thank you this morning?
$1,000 brownfield redevelopment grant from the US EPA. So I feel sort of funny criticizing the president today, but we are a little bit confused how we got thrown into the discussion about the Paris Accords, and the U.S. withdrawal away from the agreement is not going to create more jobs in the Youngstown area, not going to create jobs in Mahoning County, and so we would certainly urge the president to reconsider his decision. But at the same time, we'll take whatever other help he can provide to us.
Well, why do you think he's bringing you up then? I mean, what is it about Youngstown that makes him bring it up? And is he just plain wrong?
Well, I think a couple things. First, Youngstown is an economically challenged city. It's been challenged since 1977 when we lost 25,000 steel jobs. We're close to the Pittsburgh, West Virginia area and the coal industries. The president has talked about trying to bring back the coal industry, talked about trying to bring back the steel industry. And while we certainly appreciate the talk of improving the steel industry in our local area, I don't believe that withdrawing the United States from the Paris Accords is the appropriate course to take. I believe, right now we're left with Nicaragua and Syria as the only two countries probably on the planet who are not part of the agreement. And as part of being a major country on the planet, the U.S. has certain burdens, and being a leader on the issue of climate change is one of those. So I'd like to see the president reconsider his decision as soon as possible.
So you were not the only city that was called out. Pittsburgh got a big shout out yesterday from the president. Here's how the mayor of Pittsburgh responded.
I call it false hope, and I know them. I know them personally. They live around our city. I have family that lives in West Virginia. And what I say to them is look at the example of what Pittsburgh was able to do. If there was ever a hope from the Paris Agreement in an example of a city, I mean, Anderson, our air was so bad we had to have our streetlights on 24 hours. But we understood that we would build out a new economy and it would take time.
So what he's going to do in response, he told Anderson, is this morning sign an executive order that outlines that the city of Pittsburgh will stick to the 2030 environmental and climate guidelines and meet all their benchmark goals as they existed before the U.S. pulled out of this deal. Are you thinking about doing something similar?
Yeah, I think a lot of this discussion will be taken back to our city council. And I think that's one of the benefits of the discussion that's taking place right now is that cities all across the Midwest, what we typically call the Rust Belt areas, I think are going to get more involved in this discussion about climate change and the Paris Accords and the President's actions yesterday. I think you're going to look at groups like the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, the Ohio Mayors Alliance, really push their city members, in smaller cities especially, to get more involved in the issue of climate change, to become more knowledgeable about it. I think that's a challenge for a lot of us to make sure we're up to speed on this and to move our forward city. Here in downtown Youngstown, the past 3 years, we've built up 3 new apartment buildings. We had the first hotel in downtown Youngstown in 50 years being constructed, all highly energy efficient buildings. Our new city courthouse will be opened up later on this year, a very energy efficient building. We all have to take certain steps to reduce our carbon footprint. For smaller cities that don't have the resources of the larger cities across the country and across the globe, we have to make sure we're involved in this process as well.
All right. Mayor John McNally of Youngstown, Ohio, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, guys.
All right, so on this show and on this network, we value facts. And you have heard the president promise to bring back coal jobs, a lot of them, and to end the economic misery that far too many Americans are coping with. Well, President Trump signed an executive order in March to reverse limits on the use of coal. He told a group of miners at that ceremony, "You are going back to work." In Kentucky, a woman named Donna Coomer, who manages a gas station, told us after the election the coal trucks are out. So here are some facts.
Okay, coal jobs in Kentucky alone have fallen 64% since the end of 2011. U.S. coal jobs have fallen 50% since the end of 2011. And a driving reason for this is that electricity in the United States, more of it came from natural gas than coal. The amount of coal used to produce electricity in the U.S. has fallen about 35% since 2007. Why? Because natural gas prices have plunged. The cost to produce natural gas fell 71% from 2008 to 2016, while coal fell only 8% during that time. Last week, the president's top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, said coal doesn't even make that much sense anymore as a feedstock.
Here's facts: 1,700 coal jobs. Obama officials and State Department officials against the incoming Trump administration team. Joining us now is the State Department employee who broke this story and who spoke first to Yahoo News. Former U.S. Ambassador Dan Fried served as chief U.S. coordinator for sanctions until he retired just recently in February. Thank you for being here, Ambassador.
My pleasure.
Let's go through this bit by bit, detail by detail. What did you see and by whom?
In the early days and weeks of the Trump administration, a number of colleagues throughout the government approached me to say that they believed the Trump administration was planning to unilaterally lift sanctions on Russia. Now, lifting sanctions on Russia is something we want to do when the Russians have, well, met the conditions and solved the problem for which sanctions were put on in the first place. But lifting sanctions without the Russians doing anything as a free gift strikes me now, as a bad idea. My colleagues were concerned about this, and so was I at the time.
You said lifting sanctions is something we want to do at the appropriate time, but who's we here, Ambassador? Because if the Trump administration, after January 20th, the president was in power, isn't the we that matters the current administration?
Well, that's certainly right. And it's the president's prerogatives to lift sanctions. But now and subsequently, the Trump administration has said that it will keep sanctions in place until the Russians are, well, out of eastern Ukraine, more or less. But when I said we want to lift sanctions, the we in that case was the outgoing Obama administration, but also our European allies, the Canadians also, the Japanese, the Australians. In other words, a coalition of the world's leading democracies all imposed sanctions together in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And we all agreed that we would put on the sanctions together and we would take off the sanctions together at the right time. Now, it's the right of the incoming administration to change this policy, but I would hope they would do so after thinking it through and doing it in a rush and without good reason related to an American interest I can identify. Struck me as a bad idea.
We should note you're a career diplomat. You've worked under Republican and Democratic presidents
That's
before. What did you do about it? Because there is reporting that you went to Senator Ben Cardin to try to do something about it, to try to pass some legislation that would impact the ability to do this. Is that correct? And can you detail what you did for us?
Well, I have enormous respect for Senator Cardin. I did not meet with him after the change of administration, but it is true that I was in regular contact with congressional staff, and although I never have lobbied them, I did feel obligated to share what I knew. And officials in the executive branch regularly are asked and offer to work with the Congress. And I take that seriously. We should be working with the Congress. That doesn't mean that we share everything or that we agree. But I think it was important on the issue of sanctions to work in both a bipartisan way, which I did during the administration, and to work across the branches of government, which I also did. Yes.
Would it be a fair interpretation, because at the time you were under the employ of the State Department, you were a U.S. government employee.
Quite right.
Would it be a fair interpretation that you were working against the policy of the administration that you were working for at the time?
Oh, not at all. If there had been a policy of the administration to lift the sanctions, whether I liked it or not, I would respect it. That's my job. That's my professional obligation. What I was reacting to was simply a rumor that some people in the incoming administration were going to make a very bad decision. That's different. Once a decision is taken, all of us, career people, are supposed to, and we do, salute and carry it out to the best of our ability. And I would have done so.
Ambassador, you say this is based on a rumor, and at the beginning of the interview you say they believed, and you call it a very bad decision. Isn't that your opinion that it would be a very bad decision to lift these sanctions at that time? And is this any more than just rumors? Is there anything you witnessed or heard yourself firsthand?
I heard firsthand from a number of people within the administration who are in a position to know. That's all I'll say. I won't get into the detail.
Can I ask you, Ambassador? I ask you, Ambassador? Did you see any evidence that the Trump administration, at that point, the Trump transition, had set anything in motion prior to the inauguration? Because then that would be a different story here.
I didn't see anything concrete. I know nothing more than is in the public domain. That is the statements made by the Trump campaign during the campaign. Those are familiar. And what is in the public record. That was politics. But after the inauguration, when I heard that actually this might happen very quickly, that there were plans being carried out to lift sanctions, something I cannot and am not now verifying, but something I heard from a number of people, I was concerned. Now, you're right. If it were policy, if that were the set policy of the administration, that's one thing. But if it's simply an idea, well, people have